Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly, sometimes, podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past and talk about their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Logo Jr., and I'm joined, as always, by a man who somehow has managed to make his whole month all about vampires.
Dracula. I mean, Brett Duville. I mean, Peaches? Who am I? I'm playing too many role-playing games.
You're Drakthar.
I'm Drakthar.
As well. Yeah, which is, for the audience, is a callback to our Dungeons & Dragons game we're playing, in which my intro is alluding to that which nobody knows, in which Brett has put us against another vampire enemy called Drakthar, which has totally owned us. So yeah, he's all about vampires this month, including this game that we were playing, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Bloodlines?
If I do any more vampire stuff, I'm going to actually Vesper to Lionize. So.
Oh boy. Yeah, so Bloodlines, right? Why does that sound wrong? Okay, all right, that's correct. Yeah, so we were playing. We were attempting to finish, quote unquote, which is like there is generally an end section to each chapter, but you don't really finish per se.
Move on, which it's more that you get to a point where it's like, hey, you should go to the next area in LA.
Right.
You've unlocked the next hub. Take a cab or enter the sewers, I guess in your case, to go there.
As a side note, I was going to ask you, is the sewer option for transportation not an option for you, or do you just have both?
I think it's not an option for me. It must unlock a door for you.
It's a map. It's like a different map that is on the wall in the sewers. Not the map of the sewers themselves, but like it's a map of the city that is on the wall.
Oh, and I think that's unique to you. I've not seen that.
Okay. Because I go into the map. So when you get in the cab, what pops up? A map, or how do you? Yeah,
it's probably the same map.
I got it. It's like a road map almost.
Right.
Yeah,
it's a surface map of.
So this is just on the wall, and I go and click on where I want to on the wall, and I basically just load into that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay.
So we were supposed to play. Neither of us finished Hollywood or unlocked Chinatown is maybe more appropriate. So I don't know how far away from that we are. I feel like I'm closer than.
Yeah, you're slightly closer than I am, but I feel like we're both in the probably the section that we need to complete in order to do that. Feels like so that's been kind of interesting. I am kind of amused that we are both on the trail of the Nosferatu primogen, whose name is very threatening, much like Peaches. It's Gary.
Yeah, I wrote that name down, and there was I wrote the name down with like an exclamation and question mark behind it, but at the same time, I also kind of love it. Gary.
It's pretty funny. So it reminded me there's a vault in Fallout 3 where. That's one of the things they say. It's like all clones in there or something. I don't remember.
I vaguely remember.
Right? But they go Gary. It's like the creepiest thing in the whole game. Gary.
Right.
And they're all running around, and I think that's all their name. They're all named Gary or something. It's very strange. I don't know who came up with that one, but anyway.
So
I laughed out loud when I was like, "You've got to find Gary." I'm like. Gary, the Nosferatu primogen is named Gary. Okay.
It seems like obviously also as I'm playing a Nosferatu, but it seems like the Nosferatu clan, they have a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek aspect to their characterization. Like they're maybe because they're so grotesque looking that they're kind of like the what do I want to say? They're kind of like not the court jester, but there's another sort of archetype I'm thinking of. And they're just, like the way that people talk about them, the way they talk about themselves, it's like they're kind of self-aware of their,
Right.
And kind of like
They're
leaning
sort of like
a little bit of humor.
the Herald zombie character of a Fallout game, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what they're like. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well aware of what they look like and just leaning into it, yeah. And so as a Nosferatu, that storyline is kind of exciting to me, right? Because as I'm getting closer and closer to finding them in Hollywood, I feel like I'm finding my people, and the way some of the voice lines have been that when they talk about, finding, like when LaCroix or who's the anarch that's there
Nines?
in Hollywood? No.
Hollywood, no.
The older guy.
You mean Isaac?
Isaac, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's not. He's
an anarch. He's not. He's a Toreador, though.
Okay, yeah, he is a Toreador. I guess I didn't realize he was an anarch. I just thought he was like vying. Oh yeah, I guess it makes sense. Yeah, he was saying how they don't belong in L.A. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it does make sense.
Right.
I just read him because he's a Toreador. I was reading him as part of the Camarilla, but that's not the case. That's the clan part of it. Those are sort of distinct issues. So.
Right. You can be like Nines and and those guys are
Smiling Jack.
Bruja.
Yeah. Bruja. Yep.
Bruja, but they're anarchs as well. And not Damsel. Damsel is her name, right? Yeah,
yep.
She's so anyway, yeah. I forget why I was talking about him now. Isaac. Why was I talking about Isaac? Anyway, just the way, the finding the Nosferatu has been a fun quest for me because of who I am. So, but what I was going to jump into is what has. So we have probably a little bit of downtown to talk about as well because of where we ended last time. So I don't know how we
didn't talk a lot about downtown. For me, I mean a sort of high point you were talking about, like trying to find your own primogen. Like for me, playing a Malkavian, I thought, oh cool, I'm going to get to meet this guy Grout.
Oh yeah,
who's this character who's like an old time. He's like in between Freud and Jung, maybe like when he was born or something. It's not really clear when he was practicing, and he's got all these wonderful tapes, and the character is very developed in terms of what he's up to. And I didn't actually get to meet him because he had been killed. Which I didn't fully get. Like the window wasn't open, so I'm not sure how maybe he just. Like he had been staked, but that doesn't kill a vampire. So I don't know how he was actually.
He was tied down though too, so maybe they staked him to stun him or what have you, and then did something else. Yeah.
Yeah, that part was a little unclear. It was like what actually killed him, and then there was that dude outside,
Vampire Hunter, which was cool to meet our first Vampire Hunter. Which I think that character might be actually a famous, like kind of a canonical character. I think they've peppered in some sort of quote unquote canonical characters here and there. I don't know the lore well enough to say that for sure, but some of these I think are coming from they're essentially famous characters you could have met in the tabletop as well,
right.
Kind of thing. And then the Vampire Hunter factions. I mean, I think overall they've done, from my vague memory, I feel like they've done, in my opinion, a pretty good job at integrating all the sort of facets of the vampire sort of world building, because they're they have the anarchs and the sabbats and like all the factions, and then the vampire hunters and all the sort of rule sets and things, and I feel pretty immersed in another quote unquote world within LA.
Right.
I feel like for its time, if I put it in context for its time, they if I'm a vampire fan, even if I'm not a fan, but I'll say if I'm a fan first and I have a bunch of check boxes that I want to have checked if I play a game about Vampire, the Masquerade, I feel like they've checked a bunch of those boxes for me so far. But I think for new players, which I guess you would be considered one, I think you're probably still being introduced to these concepts pretty well.
Yeah, I do feel that way. I mean, I one of the things I really admired about Downtown, I think, was I started to feel like I was getting caught up in sort of the machinations of these sort of older vampires more so than I had felt in the previous chapter.
Yeah.
And that was interesting. And I also, because I became a partner in that club, I forget the name of it, but it's a dance club. Mm-hmm. And I became a part owner of that by doing some business for her.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah. So I also felt like, I'm also building my own base of power, right? I'm finding a way to generate, income and to be able to become more powerful myself, and therefore, maybe someday be a player. To, as Drakthar would put it, have a seat at the table. So, I do.
He's going to become an inside joke meme for us, I think. Oh, that's such a Drakthar.
That Drakthar. Anyway, so I started to feel like that was a cool thing.
Yeah.
As well. I like that some of the quests sort of take you back and forth, to different maps. There was a point at which I finally tracked down that serial killer.
Yeah, that was a cool moment.
Yeah,
because I thought that was going to be in Downtown, and then I was like, wait a second, this Lucky Star's not in Downtown, so it must be in the next one. Which I think the key we got. I think we got the key in Santa Monica, right? So it's
you get the key in Downtown in the apartment building.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
right, because you track the. I think
I played that the previous. I think I played that in the previous session, so that's why. But yeah, I think Downtown is really starting to hit the sort of, like you said, the machinations of stuff, but the political sort of tug of war that's happening. And of course, that's where LaCroix's based. So you're visiting him there, right? And in the big tower and stuff. And so there's this sense that it's kind of the main sort of heart of all of this happening, which is cool. And, the Anarchs are appropriately in their sort of dive bar setting, and there's a good contrast there. And at least for me, I assume it would be the case for you, if not even more so, the dialogue options of how you're sort of like, what different things you can say and react to for all of those groups, like, for instance, talking to Damsel in the Anarch bar, forgetting the name of the bar, but
the last round,
right? She once I finished the disease storyline, right, and came back to her, and she was impressed that I had finished it. We were kind of talking back and forth about like Anarchs versus Camarilla, and then sort of the conversation went to a direction where she's like, I was sort of leaning toward Anarch, and like in the voice lines that I would choose were focusing on supporting them and like wanting to kind of be an Anarch. And she's like, cool. Okay. Then the best thing you can do if you want to help us is to stay doing what you're doing and get closer to LaCroix, do more stuff for him. So we have a person on the inside, you know what I mean? So it was kind of neat to sort of feel like, okay, I'm going to be a double agent, like I'm going to get in there. And so when I went to go back to talk to LaCroix, even though it didn't, I don't think the voice lines completely supported it in like a super deep way. In my head, I was doing that, like, I'm going to go do the sarcophagus stuff. I'm going to be like super good soldier, quote unquote, for LaCroix, so I can get closer to him, so I can eventually help the Anarchs, and that's all great, like tabletop
and that
stuff.
Particularly plays into you as a Nosferatu, because they are sort of the spy arm, the intelligence service for the Ventru. Or
right, I love it.
The Camarilla generally, but specifically the Ventru, I guess, are kind of very powerful in the Camarilla, is my sense.
Where the information, like supposedly the Nosferatu are like the information gatherers and owners, right? It seems like. Yeah. You got that sense from the first Nosferatu you meet in Santa Monica, that he's kind of
he knows what's going on. He
Yeah.
can tell you everything about all the different groups because he knows what
the shadow
what's
broker
what.
of
Exactly.
of this world. To make another completely random, totally out of left field reference from another RPG. Anyway, yeah. So that. Yeah, it's been fun. I think downtown definitely was leaning into that for me at least. So did you as a Malkavian, was that not part of your
so I think
story?
It may have been a possible thing for me to do, but I didn't do it. One of the things that I've mentioned before is that my lines are a little more obscure, and it's not often clear.
Oh, right.
What will happen. Yeah, they're poetic, and I don't always know in a very clear way. Like if I say this, like there's one thing where the way you basically are making a choice about whether you're more into the Anarchs or the Camarilla wasn't entirely clear to me that that's what I was doing. Sort of on a mechanical basis. So I pissed her off. I pissed Damsel off, and she was like, "Well, get out of here." And then the conversation just ended. I was like, "Oh, okay.
Wow.
I guess I'm a Camarilla boy now, or Camarilla gal." So yeah, it's been like that, and it's been a little strange. I did like that I could go and meet that monster beneath. I don't even know what she is, because I'm not into the fiction, but that Pishi or whatever her name is. That's the room.
I forget the details on that type of vampire, but yeah.
So she is a vampire.
Yeah, I think she's another sort of like subspecies or separate species of vampire, I believe.
Okay,
but I don't think she's part of a clan.
Literally, a Black Widow spider could maybe transform. Like I kind of had that sense, like because spider, and they refer to her that way, and like I just didn't know. Like I was like, oh, is that a thing? Like I don't think I'm gonna be fighting a spider, because I don't think this game is up to that, but I also had that moment of like, what, I'm definitely going to work with this person here because I don't want to fight her. So some of those choices have also been that way. When I can understand what they're trying to get across as the Malkavian. So
well, I think she and again, I don't remember the details on her sort of like species or whatever, but she, and then later in Hollywood, how do you say the name of that alien dude? I
say Tzimisce, but
Tzimisce, right. That's probably right. Yeah. But those are like, those are sort of the equivalent of legendary creatures in D&D or something, right? So it's like the fact that they've found ways to include them in the story is again another one of those checkboxes for people. It's like, oh, I get to fight a Tzimisce or whatever, or I've always wondered like what those things are, so that's and she's the same thing because another cool thing about her whole Prisha, is that her name? Prisha, I think.
Pishi, I think.
Oh, Pishi, right. Is that she was her whole sort of subplot or side quest was all revolving around another sort of set piece location. Meaning, it's like, and maybe that's a segue to another topic too, but that haunted hospital feel
that place is creepy.
And it's like, it's just again another one of those tropes, right, that you want in kind of a horror game. It's like, oh, we already had the haunted hotel, which was The Shining, and now we have the haunted hospital, which felt kind of Silent Hilly to me. And then also connected to a subplot with the haunted house business, right? The live action house.
Yes. The guy who was like doing ghost tours type
tours.
Thing.
Yep. Yeah. Right. And in my case, I actually found his apartment before finding the hospital.
I had to, and his computer was in there, and it described like places you could go and stuff.
Exactly.
Like that.
So very cool, like little connections there, right? And then did you resolve that?
I think the game is at its best when it's doing those things, when it is connecting dots across and even finding stuff in advance and going, ooh, I wonder what that's about. And I think one of the things it does well, and something I need to sort of think about in connection with our earlier conversation pre-show, is like how many breadcrumbs are too many. like in how far apart can they be from when you actually learn about whatever it is. You know, it's a little easier, I think, in that there's a quest log, right? I mean, you just open up a thing and say, well, here it is.
For sure.
You know, and I think that makes you able to, as long as there's not too much time. There's definitely times I take notes as well as I play, so that there's definitely periods where I'm like, okay, well, I know what this is because I made a note. I have a checkbox, like, here's a thing I haven't figured out yet. So I have enough context that I'm keeping up with myself, that I think is somewhat necessary with any role-playing game.
You're talking about for Vampire.
Yeah, for Vampire. Yeah,
yeah,
but,
not for D. I wasn't sure if you're talking about D&D.
Not for D&D. No, well, that's totally separate. But no, I just mean like that. It's because you've got a quest log. You're just like, well, if I, oh, that's right, I'm doing this thing. I haven't resolved this thing, whatever it is, and I have that to lean back on. And
it's your checklist.
My notes kind of supplant that of like, oh yeah, that's right, I took a note about who that person is, like that vampire hunter or whatever. I don't know if I'm going to see him again, but I'm seeing those things. So
I should probably be doing that more. Like, I really have become spoiled by modern games, and I'll use like maybe Witcher as an example, Witcher 3, but plenty of good examples of great RPGs that have been doing it, of basically having that sort of not lexicon, but what's the word I'm looking for? What did Mass Effect call it? The sort of dictionary or encyclopedia of terms that you
like
add
a glossary
to.
Or whatever.
Yeah, there's a anyway. There's specific words that they use that I'm blanking on, and the audience is yelling at me. But anyway, I'll call it lexicon. But they, it's a sort of dictionary of terms or glossary of terms. Yeah, and those are auto-populated often in modern RPGs as you meet them, right? So there's not this need to feel like you have to kind of take notes yourself. So I've been spoiled. Codex, right? It's codex. And so they kind of like, you meet a new enemy or something, and once you kill it or whatever, it's entered into the log. You can go read about it if you want to, etc. And I do miss that, and I should be taking notes for this game because there's there is a quest log, but the quest log is written in.
It's very sparse.
It's a very narrative driven quest log. It's written in almost a conversational way, as if like there's somebody. It's kind of like you wrote it for yourself.
It is. It's closer to a journal, really.
Yeah, they're trying
it's not
to
organized in that way. It's
right.
It's splitting the difference there in a kind of a strange way.
Yeah,
because it'll say, I met with so and so, and he said to do the such and such, right? And so there is this kind of novelistic tone. But then it's organized very much not like a journal. It's not like the Shenmue journal, where it's like literally you're paging through a thing and things are in a particular weird order.
Yeah.
So
I think the hybrid nature of it actually is I think a weakness for it. I think they should have kind of committed to one or the other, because it kind of, I expect certain pieces of information to be in it, and then they're not.
Presentation.
Yeah. Like for instance, one of the there's been like. There was one quest that I forget what it was, but it said that I had to go back to Skelter to tell him that I had finished the quest. I could not remember who Skelter was. Like, I was like, there's no way. And so I did eventually figure it out by process of elimination, but I should just know. I should have a way to know who people are or where they are. So, and then the other thing is just, mini map or map centric. There's no map in this game really. So,
right,
that's another way that RPGs have solved that.
The bus stations.
But I mean, like,
but it's not
quest markers
it's not a player
on
focus. Yeah, it's not a player focus map. It's just a literally like, here's where the points of interest are. And even those are purely from a like, if you were in this world, this is what the map would say. Not I can take my own notes or like to tell you, hey, you find that guy Isaac here. That was actually, I had the same thing happen when I first went to Hollywood. I had to go back. Maybe it was for the serial killer or something, but I didn't meet Isaac right away. And I kept having that NPC who would come up to me and say, hey, I told you to meet with Isaac. So that it was good that they kept reminding me that the main thread is this. But what they didn't tell me was where that alleyway is that you can find him.
Yeah.
And I'm I just happened to find about an alley, and I'm like running around. I went all through these alleys, and I went up the staircase, and there's nothing there. I'm like, what am I missing? Like, and it was just, I didn't really understand when he said it. or I didn't grasp it. It didn't go in. Who knows what? And I knew he said something about an alley, and I just kind of eventually found it, just kind of randomly. And I was like, oh, that was a thing I could have had a little more direction on. So
same thing happened to me with LaCroix actually downtown, because I kept going because there was the finishing up the warehouse destruction mission says you need to go talk to LaCroix in his tower. And I just kept going into the main, lobby and like, how do I freaking get to LaCroix? This guard will not let me. I can't go up the elevators. I was like, is there a ventilation shaft I need to find or something? And the irony is that it's through the sewers, and I'm the sewer guy, So it's like, or gal.
That's wild. So you couldn't talk to him because you're ugly. I can talk. I just talked to Chunk.
Oh, shoot. Okay. No. Yeah. So that is the way you're typically going to get in. But for me,
typically you just go through the front door, you talk to the guard and says, oh yeah, Mr. LaCroix is looking for you, go on right up.
No.
He's got a lot of really funny dialogue too. If you just sit there and listen, there's one point where he's like, oh, look at you. You're so soft and round. And, he's like watching a camera and you're like, he's like peeping on somebody is what you're getting. And then at the end, he's like, no, stop. Hands off my Bavarian cream. There's a lot of he's a very funny character because he also shows up in the Santa Monica area.
Right. Oh, that's right. Yeah, he's outside guarding. Yeah. So there's another good example of the differences then, because I was like, because he didn't want to talk to me. I scared him actually. And so then I was like, shoot. So there actually is one specific which is again another sort of like tricky telegraphing problem that the game does have, which we talked about in pre-show. Inconsistencies in that it can really be a problem for especially an RPG or a world-based RPG like this, because typically sewer manholes always go up to the street level, right? And so that's how you move around. This one particular ladder went up into the building. Yeah. And I didn't know that until I've eventually found it. And I was like, wait a second, this one isn't leading to it's going inside the building. Does that, okay. And then that's how I got to the freight elevator to get to LaCroix. But I didn't find that for a long time. So I kind of was stuck. I couldn't actually move forward to Hollywood until I found that.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm really glad, honestly, I'm glad obviously for lots of reasons, but for the podcast, I'm glad we're also playing a tabletop role-playing game at the same time, because when you say something like, I couldn't remember who Skelter was, I'm like, yeah, and you would just ask the DM, and this game doesn't have that. It doesn't have the codex to be able to just look that up. And like you said, with the journal, it's not supportive of that. So the same thing with, being able to get up into this building, the DM would be basically, or the GM or storyteller or whatever it's called in the system, would be helping you by just saying, oh, you see a hallway, right? That looks different from the other ones or whatever. Just like highlight it. And kind of not so much force you, but like answer the question that you implicitly have, or explicitly have in some cases. So yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the really tough things. I'm really kind of curious with this company in particular, having done a 3.5 game or D&D 3.5 and this game and a game of their own, like what each of those experiences was like from that standpoint, to do that, and how it changes different things. Like, D&D, as we're finding playing it, doesn't adapt well to computers. I mean, it's, there's a lot of stuff that you would probably do differently if it were built that way. And this one feels like a pretty good adaptation, but I want to kind of touch on something that you mentioned in pre-show, is that it kind of doesn't feel like a role-playing game in some ways. Yeah. It is. It's sort of, there's the skeleton of it and the underpinning of the role-playing game there. But I think the reason that I brought that up in pre-show is you were saying that, you have like 30 unspent skill points or experience points, and you use them based more on what you need to do at the time rather than kind of speccing toward a certain direction. And I think that is, obviously that's a personal choice, and that's fine. But I think that also is
shining light on the design itself, on how they integrated and how much they integrated the necessity of the role-playing system into the game. Because largely I feel like as I'm playing the game, and of course I have a very different perspective as a Nosferatu, because I'm like, I feel like many times I feel like I'm playing Hitman or something, to be honest, because I'm just like skulking around everywhere and avoiding everybody and just like sneaking up and stealth killing everybody or whatever. But for the most part, like I feel like I'm playing sort of an action, first person, third person action game of this era, and an adventure game, you know, because it's a lot of like lock and key stuff, and then of course, you know, the dialogue lock and key as well, in the dialogue trees and such. But as far as like RPG elements, and it could heavily be based on the way that I'm speccing, because I'm so, at this point, so very focused in a specific way. So I'm not like experimenting with research or whatever. Like there's some other systems in there that I'm not even engaging with. So, you know, it just feels like you can pretty much, if it's an action sequence, you can pretty much brute force your way through it if you need to. And then if it's a adventure sequence, it's kind of like just finding the key, you know? So how the RPG elements come in, other than using like the Uzi, which clearly I'm very bad at using an Uzi and should never do, because my skill points are probably just not, you know, not anywhere near where they need to be. Yeah, I mean, it's a lightly implemented RPG system. So
yeah, for me, I mean, I tend to use the points. Sometimes I just use them speculatively. Like I'll save and then be like, okay, what if I spent, I don't know, a couple points in research now? I mean, what would I get from these books that I won't even tell me what they're about? Like, I'll literally go and say, well, what do I have for books that I could learn other skills from? Oh, I don't care about any of that. And I'll just reload and be like, okay, well, I know that doesn't have anything to offer me right now for the way I'm playing. So I am doing it in a very sort of gamey way. I do feel like the dialogue options are probably the place where a lot of the role-playing stuff comes through. But as a, you know, for example, you're a character who can't seduce, you know, or probably be persuasive because your appearance is 0 or whatever.
I have almost no alternate like fancy dialogue options other than just the standard ones.
I haven't had one in a while, but also because I hold my points back, that might be why. So it does feel like that's where a lot of the sort of role play stuff comes out, and that is kind of true of this, you know, of this sort of group of role playing, the wider community of role playing, you know, computer designers, game designers, you know, in the sort of Orange County, you know, Southern California area that we talked about previously. Like that's their thing. It's like there's often like a sort of a stealthy way to do things, and then there's a very conversational way to do things, and et cetera. So I think that's kind of where some of those options are. Here it's like deliberately baked into the clans, and that they kind of inherit from the license. So
yeah, and I think the disciplines, using them as sort of like the equivalent of magic or what have you, or abilities and powers, like those, not only do you get only a few anyway, but also they don't, that would be another area that I would say differentiates it from, say, you know, like at Baldur's Gate or something, where the magic system isn't critical either. You know, there's always ways around using it. It's an augmentation, but that might be another place where an RPG element would come into things. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it like I still get very Half-Life-y vibes from it for obvious reasons here and there too. And then to your point about like translating the different rule sets for their different games, the other thing to not forget for this game is, which would be interesting to know how they approached it, this is a 3D level design game. And so that's a whole different skill set. And I think some areas are better than others, but generally for their, you know, hypothetically, I guess we don't know this really to be true, but hypothetically this is Troika's for sure for Troika, this was their only and first 3D game. We don't know what everyone had worked on before, but for their first 3D game, I think a lot of the areas are pretty well done. There's definitely some that suffer from that era of level design sort of tropes, and we'll talk probably about that next time because of where you are and where I've slightly just passed you.
Yeah,
but I don't want to have the conversation now. But anyway, I think overall from the hub world design, I still have very much appreciated that sense of getting to know, the Shenmue effect of getting to know the place and then moving between the hubs, and kind of like coming back to a familiar place, and then just that sense of learning the city is cool. And then as you're peeling the onion layers of LA and getting to know more of the city with each chapter, just gives, like you said earlier, sort of like gives you a sense of you're becoming one of the well-known vampires in the city, by your deeds, but also, knowing more about the city. And it just feels like you're becoming, it's the journey, right? It's the path. It's the journey of a vampire on the rise. And, I think the other thing with RPG, as silly as it is for me to say it now that I'm thinking about it, there's no leveling, so it's like, I feel like I don't know how powerful, and I hate that because I don't want all RPGs to need that, but it's sort of hard to know. That's what makes it more of an adventure game for me, right? Because
that's a fair point.
I'm going to the places that I know I should be at because that's what the game is telling me to do, versus like, oh, I can't go to that area because I'm not high enough level. There are different systems there that
well, I think that ties into the fact that the combat is not like shallow. Because you don't get experience from combat, the combat isn't useful, right? In that sense, right? You don't get anything from doing the combat except
it's just a means for the adventure.
Yeah, exactly. You get through it to get to the next conversation. It's or it's, in the case of sort of the boss fights, it's more of a, it's a critical plot point, literally doing the combat, this one combat, but all this other stuff is filler and it doesn't contribute in any way to your level or whatever. So that I think is part of it too, is that, I was in that house with the Tzimisce in the basement, and just like, I don't want to, like, I literally, I told you in pre-show, I went around the house to the way I guess it turns out you're supposed to go. And I didn't know that. But I was like, well, I'm not going to go at this in a frontal way, because I don't want to fight all those things, because I know that those things chase this lady up the stairs. I know from this video we found, blah, blah, blah. I just want to go to the top and see what I can find. So I did that, and they make you climb all the way back down and fight all the things in the building anyway, right? So it's just like, it was funny. There's not, the combat is both not important and not really avoidable.
And not very deep, so it doesn't,
not very deep.
It doesn't feel fulfilling enough either. Well, so I wanted to ask you actually, and this relates to my spec question. So even though you haven't spent a lot of points, how are you generally, like, what's your play style with this character, both with combat and stealth and everything else?
I tend to lean more towards doing stealthy things if they're available to me. And whenever I get a dialogue option that is particularly wacky, I will say them just because why not, right? I mean, that's like leaning into the fact that I'm the Malkavian character. So it's that. Other than that, and sort of having to read those things more closely, it doesn't feel like my playthrough is terribly different than I think most players would be. I just hold back on things like, well, I'm not going to spend points on lockpicking until there's a thing I really want to open. One place where I ended up spending points to see, and ended up that being the way I wanted to do it, was to improve my obfuscation discipline, which is basically invisibility, to be able to avoid all the cameras that were in the basement of the museum, which I found somewhat frustrating because I don't think that the cameras are very difficult to read, right? Yeah, I just couldn't tell. Like, I would walk into a space to try to judge, I'd be crouched, so I'd think I was invisible, and I think maybe the meters on the side are probably telling me about this stuff a little bit more than I'm able to read it. Like, you are visible, like you're close enough or whatever. Like, there's a number and then there's a gray bar. I sort of need that to be where I'm, in the center of the screen, I think is part of my problem, just as a player. But whatever. I can't tell where the cameras are looking. I can't tell that they've seen me. And then the alarm starts going. And I'm like, oh, well, can I avoid that? Like, it took me a long time to realize, no, the cameras are rotating. You can time your movements and things like that. But by then I'd spent the points and kind of run around that level a lot more and was like, well, never mind. I'll just keep going this way. So that was one place where I spent the points just to like try to get through a thing because I didn't know what I was doing wrong. I was having a hard time. But other than that, it's been mostly like, well, I can't pick this lock. I guess I'll put a point in, in lock picking or whatever the other part of that, security and whatever the other part of it is. I try to judge which will be the best way to spend that point, either on the underlying attribute or on the sort of whatever focus.
Right. So with combat, you're doing stealth whenever you can, and then when you can't, are you doing like gunplay or melee
knife.
Or what do you?
All knife. Melee. Yep.
All melee.
I've been all melee. I used a gun in the tutorial, and that's the last time I used a gun.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was using guns for a while just to fool around with them, and I actually invested quite a bit with them. But then, decided almost more from a role playing perspective for my character, to go unarmed. And so I put, I basically boosted my brawl and a little bit of my strength up. I'm also primarily dexterity based, but dex and strength. And so, because like Nosferatu kind of have claws, it looks like, and there's kind of, the way that she moves around and stuff is sort of animalistic. And so I went that direction, and so I just punch everything now. And it's now that I've leveled it up so much, I think I might have found a bit of a balancing issue or what have you, because, like bosses aren't really that difficult. I'm just punching the crap out of stuff, and like those little guys in that section in that house you were just talking about, like, I'm just punching them in one or two hits and they're just going down, so. Yeah,
I didn't have any issues with them. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of difficulty from that standpoint. I mean. Oh yeah.
So maybe that's just
standard. The sort of the boss rush, sort of aspect. I think you were talking about the plague that was a couple weeks ago.
The three in a row, like plague. Yeah. If you do the plague storyline, you hit 3 bosses. Yeah.
If you do them all in a row, and that I think that was another thing is like I didn't do them all in a row. I would do one, I'd fight, and it would knock me down a bit health wise, and I'd go do something else so I could just heal up, just with time, right? Because you can always just stop and stand in a place. I've done this, like. The serial killer, I think one of the things he threw at me like did a bunch of damage, and or I got lit on fire or something, and I was like, well, I guess I'll just stand here in front of my computer with my phone in hand and play, threes.
Oh yeah, I haven't confronted him yet.
Yeah, my health will just come back, and I was like, I'll just. I mean, this is available to me, and in this particular case, I can't like leave and come back, so I'll just hang out and just let that happen. Yeah. I didn't have a lot of, healing implements on me or whatever. So I've ended up doing that, which is also very gamey. Like I'll just game the system.
You're Dark Soulsing it.
Yeah. I'm just like, well, I can recover here. I guess I'll just do that. It's like being in a modern shooter and just like, well, I'll just wait here until my shields come back, or I'll, whatever. It's very similar to anything like that.
Yeah.
And again, it sort of speaks to how the combat is not really the important part of the game. And it feels like it's an expectation of the audience that the audience has of games of this time, rather than a necessity of this particular game. Although maybe people expect it from a role-playing game as well. Like that's just the general thing that people expect.
Well, expect what? Sorry, what?
From a role-playing game to have combat, to have.
Oh yeah.
Filler combat,
I think it is a product of its time and that sort of era of wanting some of that action to happen. I think a little bit of it is there is an element of the franchise that has some of that in it too, especially the gunplay. There's always that sort of like seeing those sort of shots of people firing Uzis and stuff, just feels more modern. And there wasn't, when it comes to pen and paper RPGs, modern ones are fewer than fantasy ones, so so that was something that they would occasionally lean into for spikes. Obviously most of it is the political stuff, but so yeah, they probably felt, but I think it largely was coming from the era, especially that, we talked about Half-Life and kind of where action games were at. So it's just, it's suffers from a lot of the stuff that we talk about with both the Southern California, RPG groups, as well as I would say Bethesda, where it's like there isn't a system that is 100% implemented. It's more of the sum of parts.
Right.
So if you were to look at anyone individually,
more of that grotty fish stew.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yes.
We keep coming back to.
Found another one of that. Yep. Yep. And
speaking of the grotty fish stew, I want you to tell me about the stealth game, because it's part of how I play, but I don't really get. I mean, I avoid killing humans because of the.
The Masquerade.
I'm doing it well because of that, and because the prince tells me to do that. So what is this? I mean, the stealth game for you is motivated by the fact that literally, if people see you, they're going to shoot or whatever, right? Because you're hideous, and in the game. So why don't you tell me about what the stealth is like for you?
Well, I mean, I've upgraded my obfuscation as well, and I am high dex, high stealth. High lockpick, high computers. So I'm kind of the master thief, if you will. And, I don't think I fully understand how that bar and number work either. I just watch it and make sure it doesn't go to red, and kind of like experiment. But the stealth game, as we talked about, the telegraphing isn't good in the game in general, and in stealth specifically, largely it's, are they facing you or not,
Right.
And then distance. And if your stealth, the higher your stealth score is, the closer you can get to them without that number going up, is basically how I can understand it.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's like I can get pretty close to people now.
That I hadn't even kind of read that from the game, because I haven't been specifically putting points and things like that. So that's an interesting distinction that I hadn't considered. I mean, it totally makes sense. You say that, I'm like, oh, of course, that makes sense. Right. Yeah. Like
there's like, I think I'm kind of to the point where unless they are touching me or like very close to me, even if they're looking directly at me, as long as I'm not at 100%, I won't trigger them. So I'm basically crouching through the whole game. You know what I mean?
Wow, okay.
And like walking around. That's why I kind of alluded to Hitman, right? Where it's like, it's not exactly this, it's not exactly the same, because he can at least get costumes, put costumes on. But so it's just become a very different, I would assume, very different game. And now that I'm playing like melee, even when I do get into trouble, I'm just crouching through the whole game, doing the stealth kills, and then punching things. And that's like it, and because my stealth is so high, like I don't even have to worry about the meter too much if I'm crouched. And then once you get your obfuscate up, I think I'm at the level now where I get a bonus for a melee attack from being obfuscated or being invisible.
Yes, yeah, I noticed. I looked at all the levels when I was in the museum, because I was like, well, what do I do? I was in that section and I was trying to get into the area with all the cameras, and I couldn't really read them until I got a lot closer. So I didn't know what to do. And I was like, well, I'm trying different things. I covered the whole map. One frustration of that area is like, there's a whole section of the museum where there's basically a bunch of nothing.
Yeah, I was surprised.
It's a huge space to represent a museum, but there's no like alternate ways to get down to where you need to go and things like that. So it was kind of like, well, that's a kind of a bummer. It felt very like weird. That. Yeah, that felt like just something that got cut to me. It's like, why build all this space, right? And
it should have been a boss fight in there.
Yeah, there's some value to like just having a space, right, that represents a thing, to make you feel embodied and in this real world, but and at the same time you want to have some gameplay payoff as well. Otherwise you have a player like me who's like, well, okay, this isn't working, let me see what else I can do. Oh no, I can only do this, right? And that's not a fun feeling either. So I had that. But anyway, where was I going with that? I don't remember.
You're going through the section down there.
Oh, right. And I looked through all the obfuscate options.
Yeah.
Like, well, how much do I want to spend on this and I was like, oh, I don't want to kill anybody. So I don't need to put points that far, because getting a 50% or 100% or 150 or whatever percent bonus on my attacks from cover or from obfuscate, I don't want that. So let me just put in enough to be invisible to cameras and able to move. Right.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So I definitely don't kill everybody, but and I don't always listen to LaCroix when it comes to that whole thing. In fact, it's funny to come back and have him yell at you when you're like, you were supposed to not kill somebody. So I'm playing pretty like, what is the term they use? Like I don't get in, I've only gotten into frenzy once, but friends, I'm kind of a bit of a frenzied character. I'm trying to role play, to be honest, like to some degree, and it's all in my head, right? It doesn't really fully support it, but I don't kill.
Yeah. I'm supporting the Ventru because he didn't kill me, right? I mean, and they're saying, well, he didn't kill you because Nine said that would be a problem, but I'm like, but yeah, but he could have anyway, right? And so it's like, well, I owe this guy something, right? That other guy I don't really know, right? And then he saves me, and it's like, well, okay, maybe I should just try to keep them from getting at each other. But the Ventru now, LaCroix is actually, called for Nine's head, right? I mean, he's put I forget what they call it, but they've
blood contract. I forget what it is.
Yeah, I forget what it's called, but they basically have said, well, it's hunting season, on Nines.
So. I just know LaCroix is a bad guy, so I'm just like,
for sure.
And Nine seems like a good guy, so unfortunately, there's no subtlety to that, but and I'm kind of leaning toward the Anarchs because I feel like that's what my character would do, but even though I'm not killing everyone I see, if it doesn't impact my humanity, which I'm trying to manage to some degree, not be completely animalistic, I generally do take almost everybody out if I can, like enemies, like bad guy enemies.
Sure.
By the way, not to switch topics too much, but one of just because we're getting up on time, but like one of the fun things I've really enjoyed about the sort of like best of horror locations, because we talked about the mansion, or not, I mean the hotel in the one of the early
Shining,
ones,
the Overlook,
the Overlook, but it just keeps going, which I kind of have been appreciating, because we talked about the haunted hospital, there's the ship, the ocean liner that has like ancient relic on it, which is, there's some great sort of cosmic horror tropes there. There's the fancy mansion that you mentioned, right? That ends up being, which is like, I don't know, there's some great, I'm blanking on them, but there's some great sort of like bad stuff happens in those fancy houses up in the LA hills.
Yeah, it's like Crimson Peak or something like that.
Exactly.
It's definitely got a very gothic kind of feel.
Yeah. And then there's the crazy mansion, which, by the way, going into the mansion for Grout's mansion, I was like, wait a second, this is BioShock. Like, there are crazy people with masks on. There are tape recorders to listen to. I was like, wow, this is like, so, and obviously location much different, but the funny thing about that too is it harkened back to that level in Thief as well. Remember that level in Thief that was a mansion that was crazy people walking around, and it was like,
oh yeah, and in Dishonored 2 there's one too. It's Clockworks there, but
I just like, there's just something about this era. And then there's a whole nother topic about this era of enemies that you haven't seen yet that I want to talk about next time, just of like what is it with the early aughts where we in the late 90s where we just all did the same stuff. Yeah, so I just have really appreciated. And then there was sort of there's the cemetery, there's the abandoned warehouse where the cult leader was, obviously sewers, so I just feel like it's been fun being a fan of this stuff. It's been fun to like visit all of these sort of prototypical places that you would want in a modern horror kind of setting, but it's all in one game rather than being just focused on one of these topics, like say a Resident Evil would or something.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very true. I do really, I really appreciate that too. I think it's fun to have all those set pieces. I do think that's, it's got the same issue that you sort of mentioned earlier of like, well, we can't do any one of them kind of perfectly.
For sure. Yeah.
So, and that's the trade-off that you're making between focusing on a single location versus doing a whole bunch of them. But if they kind of layer in, like, I think so far the hotel and Grout's mansion have been my favorite. If they layer in the right amount of sort of pastiche of that thing, it feels just right. It feels like they've really kind of captured enough of the essence of that to feel like, yeah, you know what? I had a really good taste of that there. Like, and if they go too far or not far enough, then you're left a little unsatisfied. So.
Yeah. They have to, you're right. I think pastiche is the right way to put it. There's a sort of layer they have to hit, or like on the scale, they have to hit a certain number on the scale, but don't go above or below that. And I feel like part of it probably was based on capability and scope and technology and sort of lots of different reasons that they couldn't go beyond it. But as long as they stay in that band, and the game overall feels like it's in that same sort of like, we always use the term of like smearing the peanut butter, right? Like you're kind of, you're to a certain thickness of peanut butter, then you don't notice because it's all the same thickness.
Right.
So
it's like in art, pixel density, right? You want all the pixel density to be about the same.
Right.
Otherwise something will look too distinct because it's too sharp. It's got too many pixels, versus, okay, well, yeah, but now you've made this thing not have enough and it's super blurry and it's noticeable, or whatever. So it's a very similar sort of thing. It's a kind of peanut butter. I actually want to, I want to hit another haunted location, and then maybe we can come back after that break.
Okay, great.
Welcome back from the break. We've got some reviews that we're getting caught up on. I want to thank in advance Moss for sending those in, because neither of us use the Podcast Addict app, and apparently there's reviews there. So again, I want to remind folks, if you send us a review and we don't read it, you don't hear your name in a somewhat timely manner, our apologies. We're probably not seeing it. Just let us know where to track you down. And we've got some emails, so we'll go through all of that. But why don't you go ahead and hit me with that first review?
Okay, review here from Spodboy from Podcast Addict. A wonderful, interesting, and informative podcast. The hosts show great knowledge discussing games from my childhood and how they influence the games industry and game design itself. They have some great guests who worked on these games to help understand the design process and constraints the developers worked under and how these classic games came to be. Thank you for this show. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Spodboy.
Thank you. Happy to be your Spodcaster, as it were.
Nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have the other one from Podcast Addict from John Cheatham, who writes, "To experienced devs give their insights on classic games, always informed and insightful. Love the multi-episode format, which allows the host to go in depth," which I also like. I like that I don't think we could do this if we were just playing the game of the, I don't know how, well, I guess it's often people who spend all their full time on games and things like that in terms of playing, and, you know, journalists or whatever on the Beastcast or whatever,
Right.
who are talking about the latest game every week. I couldn't do it. So,
Yeah. I mean, oof, yeah, that's a lot of commitment.
yep. Anyway, thank you to both of them. And I did have a finally, who I've been calling out to for a while, reached out and said, I caught up. I was a little behind. I was still in the Populous episodes. He had sent in a review that was titled, quote, "Entertaining and Informative Podcast," with then the instruction, it was in parentheses, it said, "Sing to the tune of 9 p.m. from Animal Crossing New Horizons." And then that was it. And I thought, it got cut off. And I went and listened to the tune. I'm like, well, I don't think I could sing just the subject, so it must just be cut off, and that's why I was asking. No, what it was a joke. I don't know if this is a commentary on my singing voice or his lyric writing capability, but he was trying to get me to play just some Animal Crossing New Horizons music, I guess, and have an instrumental that I'm supposed to sing along to, which is to say not sing at all. So thank you. You know who you are, and now I know who you are. Thanks for helping out on Twitter. But yes, thanks for those. We also have from email to devgameclub@gmail.com. We've got a few mails, so why don't you go ahead and hit that first one?
Okay. I'm
giving you all the long ones this week, so have fun.
Okay, thank you. That's appreciative. My favorite pseudo-indirect control game from John Webb. Hi, Brett and Tim. Over the course of listening to your Populous playthrough, you both talked about indirect control throughout. I thought about it. I thought about how indirect control leads to heightened tension in an entertaining way. In one of my favorite SNES RPGs, and probably one of my favorite games ever, Ogre Battle: March of the Black Queen. I have no idea what that is. The meat of this game occurs in two contexts: Mode 7 battlefields, in which units move around, engaging each other if they get too close, and small skirmish battlefields that are zoomed in encounters showing what each individual does in the skirmish between two battles. The player has precise control over where their units go on the larger scale Mode 7 map, but in most fights, the player can only control their units by setting one of 4 commands, which are best, leader, strong, and weak. Whoa. Best makes your units deal as much damage as possible. Leader makes them target the enemy unit's leader. Strong makes them target enemy units that have the most HP, and weak does the opposite. Each individual unit having multiple attacks, the end result is that absolute control of each fight is very difficult, if not impossible. There are a few important ramifications of this system configuration. Number 1, the player is encouraged to learn quickly what units have which attacks that are effective against different foes or in different situations. Number 2, because there is less control over each swing of the sword, so to speak, gameplay is streamlined, and the player is responsible for less clicks while also retaining control over the overall strategy of the campaign. And 3, a rhythm of play is created in which the player is providing input until the battle is started, a strategy is chosen, and the player watches for entire moments as the minions wail on each other. The player can pause at any time to change strategies, retreat, or use tarot cards. Another mechanic I won't go into. Thank you, John. But there is still a salient feeling of becoming a watcher in this game that is unusual for the genre, in my opinion. There are probably more, but these are the ones that made me want to write in when I heard you talking about the indirect control. I don't care for idle games that seem to have become more common in the past few years, but I do like the ogre battle layers the player can control, such that there are times the player is not giving inputs and just watching their strategic decisions transpire. It's an interesting game for this and other reasons, and in my opinion, would make a strong candidate for DGC inspection if you ever run out of ideas. Thank you both for this podcast. I'm currently listening to the first couple of episodes of Vampire the Masquerade, which I am also a fan of, but I've never finished. I'm a bit old scaredy cat. I'm a big old scaredy cat, and I quit every time I start at a certain point that they both will get to, that you both get too soon. I know you two will be braver than I. Regards, John Webb. Wow, epic.
I don't know if I'm any less of a scaredy cat, but I am pushing through. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I when I originally read the email, I was confusing this game with Tactics Ogre.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That's
too.
what called to mind, and I was like, "Oh, I remember there's that ogre game." It was not the right one, so I just looked it up. I kind of like. There's something about that indirect control over an army that I kind of like. That is, it's like a level removed from like an RTS. You know, it's more like this is our sort of stance right now. Maybe has sort of a feel like. Oh, what was the Bungie series? There was two of them. Myth, right.
Yeah.
And, you know, whereas like, well, you set up your stance and that determines how they react. And you can do a similar sort of thing as stop at any time and take direct control really to some degree. I mean, it is a lot more RTS-y than not, but it did have a different sort of feel at the time. Another game I wouldn't mind giving another look at. I don't think I ever finished either one of those games, but they were good. I mean, I think I got busy with other things. We were working on games. But yeah, I like the sort of idea of it feels more like you're a general at that point. Like you can't micromanage every unit on a battlefield when you're the general. You just kind of have to say, you over there, that group, attack with all your might. You know, this group over there, pull back. You know, or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and then watch and see as that develops, and there's a sort of, as he says, rhythm or dynamic that occurs, and you kind of have to let that play out and see if it's going to play into your hand or not. I think that Populous feels both indirect and still frantic. Often because you're trying to manage the land so much. Like I gotta create more space as fast as I can. So it's you don't have those moments of sort of repose really, and just waiting for something to build up, unless you're waiting to do like Armageddon.
Right. So. Well, I mean, it's I think we were throwing indirect around a lot. I mean, it's indirect when it comes to units because that's typically what direct control means, but it is direct when it comes to the terrain, which is atypical of these kinds of games of something you would have direct control over. Usually you'd have no control over the terrain. So it's like this weird, it's such a weird game.
It's a weird inversion.
Yeah. And as we know, came from such a weird place now, having Glenn on. And so, but I think to John's point, like, I'm also wondering, especially because that was a SNES game, you know, these ogre battles specifically, and maybe anything in this area of indirect control, maybe was grappling with the concept, kind of like you said, of like, how do we make a strategic game with within the controls and interface that we have at our disposal? You know what I mean? And having some of that simulation kind of, you know, before RTSs really became a thing, and even RTSs on console are barely a thing. They do exist, but they're not that common. And that's kind of where you know, MOBAs kind of evolved into in some ways. And so it's like, well, we kind of want that feel of that battlefield, but we're going to take control away because we don't really have the ability to give direct control in an elegant way yet. I don't know. It's just interesting to know what their motivations were, but thanks for writing in about that specific one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not familiar with it at all, and I don't know that we'll get a chance to look at it just because SNES games are hard. I mean, you can probably get them emulated and things like that, but it's hard to get them sort of legitimately, which is something we like to support, it being our industry and all. But yeah, I have one here from Warren Linham Church. The subject is iteration. He's saying, I was just listening to your Star Wars Republic Commando episode where you talked about your quote-unquote failed milestone experience. It made me think of the John Romero and Glenn Corpse interviews where when working on games in an earlier era, it was possible to turn around games very quickly. That seems like a really good way to learn a lot of things quickly. But in the milestone you described, 6 to 8 weeks seems like an awfully long time to learn anything. So long that it can't possibly be how y'all actually iterate on things. So how do y'all try out things in the current realities of AAA development? From Warren Linham Church. Tim? I mean, I remember the specifics of the Republic Commando milestones. So I can talk about that. But yeah, to iterate on design is at the AAA level. That's a scary thing right there. The creative director, man.
Yeah, I mean it is. I think his sort of how confounded he sounds in the email is a real thing. It is very difficult in AAA to iterate on, especially anything new that might be perceived as new or unproven. And I think, I mean, part of the answer also is that it depends. Like there are ways to have quick loops, iterative loops on things before you get into high quality versions of those things, you know, when it comes to prototyping. Right. And those can be, you know, days, sometimes, you know, even days, but mostly weeks, you know, of a sprint or something like that, 2-week sprint. So that can be commonly done. And in fact, that's what you ideally want to do is, you know, do it in a time when you can quickly iterate. Unfortunately, though, I think with AAA games, there are times when a feature or experience is actually a pretty multifaceted problem that involves lots of different disciplines at once. And so you actually need, you know, for instance, the art to get to a certain fidelity to understand whether something's going to work, or, you know, audio to get to a certain fidelity. So you actually need kind of everyone to come together to make a thing. And that can take a long time sometimes to do that. I mean, there really isn't, there's no perfect answer there. I think the best thing you can do is as you're going through that process, setting your own checkpoints and gates along the way to be able to, you know, stop working on something that isn't working and just kind of make sure you're validating that it continues to work throughout those weeks and potentially months of something working. But, you know, at the end of the day, you kind of want to avoid that situation, to be honest. You want to make sure that you don't let something go too long. I've definitely been guilty of allowing things to go too long that weren't working, for sure. And so you want to try to put those gates in. Often they are broken down into 2-week sprints, as you probably know. And so that's one of the ways you can get those gates. But sometimes you need things to go a little ways before you realize it's, you know, your theory wasn't going to work, unfortunately. Because AAA games are hard, high fidelity stuff is hard, and sometimes you don't really see that until it's too late, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can talk a little bit, and then maybe we can address the Republic Commando one specifically. But for example, the Skyrim dragons, and I'm pretty sure Todd's talked about this sort of publicly, so I'm not revealing any deep secrets here or anything, but that was basically a couple of people kind of peeling off and iterating sort of separate from the rest of the game for a period of time. In fact, I don't even think they were running the full engine, as it were. It was like literally the renderer and the animation system, but none of the sort of higher level stuff, just to figure out, well, how would this fly and look and land and whatever, and using, you know, just boxes and, you know, flat spaces and things like that, just to animate, prove out, okay, you'd need this much space. Oh, we want to have this thing crash. Like what would that look like? You know, and just trying to figure out what systems needed to be built to support that instead of trying to shoehorn it into existing stuff. And that turned out to be a real success. In fact, another way that you deal with this is you plan for failure, in that, you know, and this I know Todd has talked about, we didn't know the dragons were going to work out as well as they did. They were not originally as primary to the game, you know, as we sort of ended up with, right? They were not there were going to be a few, right? And they were going to be sort of more, I wouldn't say scripted exactly, but more scripted certainly than Bethesda games normally are, less systemic than they turned out to be. And it just turned out that those iterations really yielded something really workable, that could fit, and could actually really shine and be kind of all over the place. And it happened by doing sort of lots of very small, like they knew they were going to have to build the model anyway, so they built sort of a quick one that had sort of like figured out how many bones and things like that, just sort of asset type issues to figure out, like, okay, what kind of animations would we need, et cetera, et cetera. And you just kind of iterated on all of that very quickly among a very small team, like 2 or 3 people most of the time. And the other thing I guess I would say is that you kind of, you try to ignore things that you can do. Like, just don't do this thing that you know how to do. Just, if it's like, oh, well, the AI is going to need to run and pop behind cover, then just move them on a straight line, put them in a pose that puts them behind cover so they can't be hit, or even just change their physics volume. So it's like, well, they're behind cover now. Sorry, you can't hit them, right? If you're proving out some shooting area or something like that. So there's a lot of sort of cheats. As long as you're signaling what's going on, that lets people be able to squint at it and say, oh, okay, I see. Like, I can envision what this will be. And that's what you're trying to prove out. Like, I'm coming in this space as, I don't know, Nathan Drake or something. Yeah, we don't have enemies that can run up and crouch behind a thing and then pop around and shoot. But let's just pretend those other things are happening. What kind of spaces do we need to build to support that? Might be a question you're trying to ask yourself in pre-production. So, as far as that specific Republic Commando example, that was a pretty late milestone for us. We were trying to prove what it takes to either get something to alpha or beta. I don't recall which, but sort of like the stage of like, okay, we've actually roughed out this level and we have a sense of the pacing and where enemies are going to be, what's going to be needed. And we've have all the asset lists made or whatever to make this thing. Let's actually take it to the next sort of step and level, and figure out the actual remaining production questions we didn't have answered. So, it was more of answering those sorts of questions, like, oh, this is how long it's actually going to take to bring something, any one of these, however many levels we had, 15 or whatever it was, to a sort of final or near final space.
Yeah, that actually was a different goal than what I was kind of alluding to. I think that those are bigger milestones that are intended to be he's longer. Yeah, he's certainly right in that was not a.
What we were learning was a bunch of sort of really production questions, like how many bodies does it take to do these sorts of things, and that it was the questions there were really production, scheduling type questions, and those are just, it takes a while to actually suss that all out, and we're just delivering on it to make sure that was true. And the first time you do things takes a little longer, and I mean, you kind of have to make adjustments, but you do need to know those things and figure out where your gap for where you're not hitting things right, and that in that we failed it, we also learned a lot. So anyway, and then there's I think you have one more email, right?
Yeah. Yep. All
right, let's hit that.
Okay. Vampire seems to stalk me, from Dar Danielson. Hello, Tim and Brett. I was very happy when I heard you guys were going to play Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, as it's a game I replay often, and I have a funny anecdote regarding the World of Darkness property. First, a short point. After my last message, you theorized I might be a lawyer. While I'm flattered by your hypothesis, I am in fact a developer, mostly gameplay programming, and dabbled in game engine creation, with a passing interest in law, mostly though YouTube. Okay, YouTube lawyer.
Through YouTube, I think, probably.
Through YouTube. Now, my story with the World of Darkness. After playing Bloodlines 1, me and a couple of my friends decided to play the tabletop RPG roughly 10 years. And a university education later, I landed a job at CCP Games, where I took a small part in a now infamous attempt at Vampire the Masquerade MMO. Yes, we were alluding to this, I think. I have since left that job and moved countries, mostly to seek a more advanced degree in game design and development. Now I'm not allowed to say much due to the NDA, but it seems that my next job might also involve Vampire the Masquerade yet again. This franchise seems to follow me across decades, countries, and jobs, and personally, I wouldn't have it any other way. To finish off, I always enjoy the podcast and find it funny that you are Malkavian and Nosferatu, respectively, the two clans not recommended for the first playthrough. Oh, but in my opinion, the most interesting ones. I hope you continue. I hope you continue to enjoy the game. It does get a bit rocky toward the end, as it is, for obvious reasons, a game I have fond memories of. Best regards, Dar A. Danielson. We think we got that pronunciation right this time.
Finally. It's like the fourth time he's written in.
Though I did want to say dagger this time instead, but no. Tell us if we got it right, if we understood correctly. Wow, so that's interesting. So good luck with all of your vampire adventures. And
for sure.
Getting to work on a franchise that you love is a treat. So, and it's kind of neat that you've happened upon that multiple times. And it's interesting
and that you still love it. That's a hard thing, actually.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree. Interesting that Malkavian and Nosferatu are known to be sort of the harder playthroughs, and often that is the case. That would make them also the most interesting ones. But it has been very intriguing to wonder how different the writing is for my character, because almost obviously, as you can imagine, almost everybody has pretty unique things to say about me just because of the way I look,
Right.
So I think that there's quite a bit of, maybe it is the case for every clan, but for me specifically, there's quite a bit of unique content, I would say, for how they're reacting to me for the most part.
Yeah, and that does really speak to this game being one that could be replayed quite a lot and get, not one after the other probably, because I think the quests would kind of get repetitive just seeing them again and again and again. But with the writing being so primary in that way, and really kind of standing out, I think that's that's interesting. And I've now heard that multiple times. Like, this is one that I'd take off the shelf. I mean, we had email last time, I think, as well, to that effect. I've played it multiple times, and that's wild to me. And it's funny because that's normally like a choice thing. Like, what choices did I make? And here it feels more like, no, it's just literally feels different to play each of the types, like each of the clans might feel different.
Yeah. It's a series that I missed, and I don't know if I ever actually will play, even though I'm a fantasy RPG fan, is the Dragon Age series. But I've heard that the different races that you play in that game have quite a bit, of different sort of reactions to them, at least in the first game, because it's all about sort of the origin of your character and stuff. So I'm talking about this third hand in an ill-informed way, but maybe that's
that
a
did
modern
have
example.
So it had that first chapter, I think, was unique to each race. But yeah, often it's like, I can't imagine playing, well, I guess I was going to say like a D&D game, but usually those are party based and not sort of, I mean, this is like a solo character, and that really makes a big difference. That might be the big difference with RPGs. Like, I could imagine playing the Mass Effect series again, but again, that feels more like, well, I'd make choices differently and see how different choices played out. And not so much that the actual moment to moment experience would feel pretty different, as this one feels like it would. Like, I felt very different when I restarted the game as a Malkavian, having discovered that we picked the same type originally, and not wanting that just for podcast reasons. It felt distinct in a real way, especially as the Nosferatu not being able to go above ground. It was like, oh my, this is a very different game. I could totally see that being different, and that's a real selling point for me. That's a hard thing to do, especially with whatever we said, seven clans or something like that. That's a lot. I mean, it also has some choices that feel we've kind of glossed over a little bit this time about, whether you support the anarchs or what have you. But even that sort of at a macro level, I don't know. It probably ends up in a few different places like Deus Ex did. Like there's a few different possible endings.
Yeah.
Or even Mass Effect for that matter, right? There's basically 3 endings to the third game. So.
Yeah, you can definitely. I can see the boundaries to certain conversations pop up. The limitations of how it gets you, kind of like the permutations that get you back on track.
Right.
So, like for instance, talking to LaCroix, when I first come back to him after a mission. Usually it's fairly focused on me as a Nosferatu and kind of how I obviously acted in that mission so he can respond. But then, like 4 or 5 pieces of dialogue into the conversation, you can kind of almost see the flow chart where they pop you back onto the top of the stack,
Right.
and then they go through what everyone probably sees. To get you to the next quest, so you kind of, so you can see the boundaries there somewhat, because because his reactions to me are so extreme, you can see the difference, quite big difference between the attitude change. But most of the time it's pretty smooth. But because they couldn't, they just couldn't do it infinitely, but it's all a matter of scope and such. But
I see that a lot too. You're right in that I will speak to somebody and they will point out that, oh, you're a Malkavian, and they'll say, oh yeah, I've noticed that you tend to cut through to the heart of a matter in an indirect way, right? By talking through poetry, you get at the truth or something like that, those sorts of things. But then after that, it does kind of channel back down into, even if my responses still read uniquely.
Yeah.
That's just text and that's cheap, right? So that's fine. Like that's an easy thing to do, to make my answers harder to parse for me as the player. But then I can tell that the NPCs have kind of returned to a channel. But I mean, it is a lot about your experience as the player, as that, as what your choices are and how you present them, that I think gives the game a lot of its flavor. And I think would make for an interesting replay. So I'm not going to commit to replaying this one, but like the million hours of Kingdom Hearts that I've somehow gotten myself into. But,
yeah, I know you always say that, but then there's plenty of examples that are contrary to that. So for you, and not to end on a somber tone, but we did want to at least just mention that, for anyone who's playing along, and there are some problematic parts of the game that when it comes to especially dealing with how women are portrayed in the game, that we're not going to get into details or sort of like pick it apart, but I think it's at least needs to be mentioned that it's not handled well in various places, and so please be aware of that.
You should see my character in third person, Tim.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a choice. And I don't know if the third person female characters all end up looking, I mean, other than the Nosferatu, which is, beastly. I saw that one as well, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm basically wearing a thong and chaps, I think. And then and I have 2 different clothing choices.
Yeah.
And I can't really, neither one of them looks like they'd protect me in any way. So I'm not sure what the difference between them is. One was it's a heavy jacket. I'm like, I'm not wearing a jacket. I have a cross on my back in red against black. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some real presentation issues, as well as some choices even in the text with women that I definitely have rubbed me the wrong way, to say that the very least.
Yeah. So, they're definitely just something to be aware of for people, so and I think we at least wanted to call it out that it's unfortunate, but, so anyway, But so next time we will be trying to play through to the, quote unquote end of Chinatown, I believe, right?
Yeah, I mean, I forget it, Jake. It's where is it?
Yeah, right.
I went there again. I'm gonna just return to that well as often as I can.
Right. I wonder if we're gonna get our nose broken or not in this one.
Exactly. Or cut.
Cut. Is it cut? Or is it's just cut?
It gets a cut. He puts it inside his nostril and then pulls away. Ugh, it's gross. One of the grossest things I've ever seen in a movie. Anyway, we will try to get through Chinatown and towards the end game, so that we cover the end game and our takeaways in the episode after that. So that's our goal. We haven't done particularly well at meeting our goals thus far, so we'll see how it goes next week. In the meantime, we love to see those reviews, and we read everyone. And again, if we don't, it's probably because we didn't see it. And just point us that way or send it in via email with all your other feedback at devgameclub@gmail.com. You can find us on the web at devgameclub, where I put all the show notes and the episodes you can listen to there as well if you'd like. And currently there's also what we've played. All the interviews are collected in one page, and also my book reviews, or book recommendations, I should say, all together in their own pages so that you can find that stuff easily. You can find us on Twitter at DevGameClub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
And our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast, Aaron Evers. Thanks so much to both of them. Have fun scouring Chinatown this week. I don't even know. And good night.
Good night.